During World War II, fuel was scarce, nights were long, and fires that burned hot and fast were a liability. A roaring stove meant wasted fuel, visible smoke, and a cold tent by morning. Military engineers and field improvisers learned a different lesson. The goal was not a bigger fire, but a smarter stove. The breakthrough was the stove core, a dense heat storage mass placed inside or around small field stoves so they could release warmth slowly for hours after the fire died. This quiet trick kept command posts, aid stations, rail cars and winter quarters livable through the night with minimal fuel. What the stove core actually was and why it mattered. The core was not a new invention, but World War II made it portable and practical. It consisted of dense materials such as sand, stone, brick fragments, cast iron blocks, or even scrap steel packed into a central chamber or surrounding jacket. When the stove burned, the core absorbed heat that would otherwise escape up the flue. Once the fire dropped to embers, the stored heat radiated outward, keeping temperatures stable until morning. The stove stopped being a flame box and became a thermal battery. How this differed from ordinary stoves used before the war. Traditional potbelly stoves heated air quickly but cooled just as fast. Once the fuel was gone, so was the warmth. World War II stove cores changed the equation by prioritizing thermal mass over immediate output. A smaller fire burned cleaner and shorter, while the core did the long work. This reduced fuel consumption, cut smoke signatures, and, allowed soldiers to sleep without waking to stoke fires in sub-zero conditions. This is where, this trick was used in real wartime settings. Railway crews in Eastern Europe packed sand-filled steel jackets around small stoves in rail cars to prevent freezing overnight. And field hospitals used brick-lined stoves to maintain steady temperatures, which were absolutely critical for wounded soldiers. Arctic and alpine units, often improvise stove cores by using stones gathered locally, packing them right into metal drums or surrounding stove bodies with masonry. Even in civilian air raid shelters, those heat-retaining stove cores managed to keep occupants warm during blackout conditions. So, how did the physics make this trick so effective? Well, dense materials have a high specific heat capacity, which means they can absorb a large amount of energy before their temperature increases much. Once heated, these materials release that energy slowly. In a stove core, heat transfer happens through radiation and convection, long after the combustion has ended. This really helps to smooth out temperature swings and reduces the need for constant refueling. Now, let's talk about how soldiers and engineers built these cores step by step. It was a process that required patience, resourcefulness, and a fair bit of improvisation, considering the conditions they faced. First, they identified materials that were dense, non-flammable, and, locally available. Sand was often favoured, because it packed tightly and distributed heat evenly, which was absolutely crucial. Stones and bricks worked well, but they had to be dry to prevent cracking, of course. The material was placed either inside a hollow stove chamber around the firebox, or sometimes in a secondary jacket surrounding the stove body. And naturally, care was always taken not to block airflow or the flue. Otherwise, well, the whole system could fail. The fire was then burned hot for a short period to charge the core, after which airflow was reduced and the stove allowed to coast. Why this approach reduced fuel use dramatically? Instead of feeding a stove all night, crews burned one or two intense loads in the evening. The core absorbed excess heat that would normally be lost. Overnight, the stove continued radiating warmth without active combustion. This was, honestly, critical in regions where fuel resupply was unreliable or dangerous. Less wood burned meant fewer trips, less exposure, and, well, greater operational security. How modern builders and survivalists can apply this knowledge today? This trick is, highly relevant for off-grid cabins, workshops, and emergency shelters. A simple steel stove can be transformed by adding a sand-filled steel box beneath or around it. Fire brick lining inside the stove improves heat retention. Even placing a thick layer of stone or brick around a stove, leaving safe air gaps, can significantly extend heat output after the fire goes out. The principle is to store heat first, then release it slowly. Practical examples that still work in modern settings. A cabin stove surrounded by stacked fire brick will stay warm hours longer than a bare stove. A metal drum stove with a sand-filled base radiates heat well into the night. In emergency shelters, a small stove set next to a stone wall turns the wall into a heat reservoir. These are not theoretical ideas, They are proven methods refined under wartime pressure. What the World War II stove core teaches about efficient living is, the lesson is restraint. Bigger fires are not better fires. Controlled combustion paired with thermal storage produces comfort with less effort. Wartime engineers understood that energy wasted is energy lost forever. Their solutions favoured endurance over intensity. Why this forgotten trick deserves revival. In an era of rising fuel costs and renewed interest in resilient living, the stove core offers a timeless solution. It's simple, scalable, and grounded in physics rather than technology. It worked when resources were scarce and conditions unforgiving, and it works just as well now. If you value real historical solutions that still perform in the modern world, subscribe to In the Beginning. Share this episode with fellow history buffs and survival-minded builders, and help keep practical knowledge alive where it belongs.